Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters, and I am a program analyst from the Energy Policy and Evaluation Branch of the Office of Community Services Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar providing an overview and reminders for the fiscal year 2020 Carryover and Reallotment Report. Today's webinar will be presented by Dan Bausch from Apprise. Today's webinar has four purposes. First, the webinar will briefly review the purpose and use of the Carryover and Reallotment Report. Second, Dan will explain changes made to the form for this year's report based on the award of the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. Third, the webinar will highlight common issues and questions that grantees have with items in the report. And finally, the webinar will provide key reminders to help you in successfully submitting your report. The audience for this webinar is LIHEAP coordinators, fiscal, or other staff that help with the Carryover and Reallotment Report. Our hope is that today's webinar is helpful, and we thank you for attending with short notice. So with that, I will turn this presentation over to Dan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Sharnice said, I know that there wasn't much advance notice of the webinar, so I really appreciate you taking the time to attend, and just want you to know that OCS is working hard to make the announcements for each of the reports and to schedule the trainings as soon as is possible. Today's webinar is going to be 30 minutes to review key information for the FY20 Carryover and Reallotment Report. It will be a brief webinar, and I want to encourage you to download the slides. They're under the handouts section of the GoToWebinar sidebar, and those slides have a few extra slides at the end about using OLDC to be able to enter your data, submit your form, or make revisions. So I encourage you to download those so you have a copy. And we are recording the webinars, and we'll be putting that on the ACF YouTube channel. Throughout the webinar, you have the option to submit questions in the question box. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so I encourage you to submit any questions you have. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar, and if there's any remaining, Jorge will have them, and we'll be able to reach out to you by email. So first, it's important to just talk about the purpose of this report and why OCS asks grantees to submit this report each year. As you know, you're awarded LIHEAP funds each fiscal year based on the LIHEAP funding award that is passed by Congress. For regular LIHEAP funds, grantees need to obligate no less than 90% of those funds in the fiscal year that they were awarded. The Carryover and Reallotment Report exists to help capture information on whether a grantee has any unobligated funds and if they're going to be carried over to the subsequent fiscal year or if they'll be returned to the federal government. And the report allows OCS to identify grantees that are going to be carrying over returning funds, and it helps to develop their preliminary determination of any funds that will be available for reallotment to all grantees in the subsequent year. You'll notice I highlighted some terms on that slide. Those are some key terms we're going to go over that I want you to keep in mind. So as all of you know, it has certainly been an unusual year, and the impact of the coronavirus has led to changes for LIHEAP as well. In March, the Congress passed and the President signed into law the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. As part of that act, Congress appropriated about $900 million in supplemental funds for LIHEAP. And OCS released those funds in May and provided that information in a Dear Colleague letter. That Dear Colleague letter notified grantees that they would need to track, account for, and report on their use of LIHEAP CARES Act funds. So to allow OCS to be able to monitor the use of those funds and to report that information, The Carryover and Reallotment Report has been revised for FY20 as well as for next year's FY 2021 Carryover and Reallotment Report. So what changes have been made to the Carryover and Reallotment Report? First, there have been changes to how the form looks and how it's organized. The form used to consist of one section with a few lines that you were asked to report. Now you'll notice that the form consists of 3 sections. Section 1 is for reporting on regular LIHEAP funds, and that's the same information that you've been asked to report in past years. No changes to any of the lines or the requirements in that section. Section 2 is new, and that's where you'll report information related to the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. And then you'll also notice there's a third section in the form, but that third section is reserved for other supplemental funds and is not applicable for this year's FY 2020 report. That's not able to be edited, and it's reserved in the case that additional supplemental LIHEAP funds get issued. So in addition to changes to how the report looks, there have been changes to the reporting requirements, but I want to first stress that there have been no changes to any of the reporting requirements for regular LIHEAP funds. So the way you completed the Carryover and Reallotment Report last year and in prior years for your regular LIHEAP funds is the same as how you'll complete it this year. The new reporting requirements are related to the LIHEAP CARES Act funds, and the report asks you to report the amount of those funds that you did not obligate during fiscal year 2020 and are being carried over to fiscal year 2021. And I'm going to talk more about that on subsequent slides. So now I want to review some of the key concepts for completing the Carryover and Reallotment Report. First key concept is obligations. Grantees are required to obligate LIHEAP funds for specific uses that are consistent with the LIHEAP statute and regulations. And the Carryover and Reallotment Report is really focused on how you obligated or did not obligate funds that were awarded to you during a particular fiscal year. The LIHEAP statute provides flexibility for grantees in defining what constitutes an obligation of funds. It's not explicitly defined, and the definition for obligation varies across grantees. It can be based on your state or your government's rules for obligations across different programs, and it can also be impacted by your program structure and whether you administer LIHEAP through a network of partners or if you administer it through your own program offices. But some common examples of what an obligation is are official designation of funds for specific purposes, or the commitment of funds, the issuance of funds, the encumbrance of funds for specific purposes to your subgrantees or partners. When thinking about obligations, it's important to remember that they're not always the same as expenditures. Expenditures generally include the benefits that are issued or paid. And in some cases, funds that you obligated for a purpose might not be expended until after a fiscal year has ended. So for example, you may obligate a certain amount for heating assistance during FY20 using your FY20 funds, but a portion of those funds might not actually have been expended and paid out as benefits to clients until FY 2021, for example. So with the Carryover and Reallotment Report, the focus is always on obligations. So we'll be talking a little bit more about what you're asked to report for obligations and unobligated funds. Next key concept for reporting is carryover funds. Carryover funds are funds that you were awarded in a fiscal year that you have elected to carry over or hold available for obligation in the next fiscal year. For fiscal year 2020, you have two funding source categories that you're being asked to report on. Those are regular LIHEAP funds and your CARES Act funds. And the carryover rules for those two buckets or two categories are a little bit different. For regular LIHEAP funds, as is the case every year based on the statute, you're allowed to carry over up to 10% of those funds from the fiscal year you were awarded them to the subsequent fiscal year, where you can then obligate them. For the CARES Act funds, you were allowed to carry over up to 100% of those funds from fiscal year 2020 to fiscal year 2021. So grantees may have obligated all of their LIHEAP CARES Act funds during FY 2020. They may have used some and carry over other funds to obligate in the subsequent year, or you may have decided to carry over all those funds. Another key concept is the idea of returned funds, also called the Re-Allotment Amount in the report. For regular LIHEAP funds, as I mentioned, you can only carry over 10%. And so if you have funds above 10% that were not obligated during a fiscal year, then those funds need to be returned to the federal government. HHS compiles all those funds and determines the total amount available and then redistributes them among grantees during the subsequent fiscal year. This last bullet is really important just to keep in mind, is that the grantees are responsible for taking steps to mitigate the risk of returning federal funds. And so if during the course of a fiscal year you anticipate that you'll have challenges in obligating all your funds during that fiscal year that you're not able to carry over, then you should reach out to your liaison to discuss that situation and to work through that. Now we're going to look at each of the two sections that you need to report on in this year's report. First section is for reporting on regular LIHEAP funds. So section 1 is focused on all regular LIHEAP funds only. This, I want to stress that this is the same information that you would have reported in the past in this section. They're the same reporting requirements as last year's FY19 report. Regular LIHEAP funds for fiscal year 2020 included the block grant funds that you received at the beginning of fiscal year 2020, as well as the FY19 reallotment funds that were awarded at the end of fiscal year 2020, at the end of September. The Carryover Reallotment Report is focused on funds you were awarded during fiscal year 2020. So if you had funds you carried into 2020 from fiscal year 2019, those aren't included in this report. And any non-LIHEAP or non-federal funds are also not included and not the focus here. Next slide, Jorge. Okay, so the first line in this section is line 1.1, and that's the current year amount payable. This should be the total amount in regular LIHEAP funding that you were awarded during fiscal year 2020. And OCS uses their awards information to pre-populate this for you in the OLDC system. So you should look at that amount and compare it against your own records to make sure it's correct. If it does not appear to be correct and it doesn't match your records, there might have been an issue with the pre-population, and you can try to resave your report or revalidate it to see if that changes. But if you're having difficulties and you've tried doing that or tried deleting and reinitiating, then reach out to your liaison or reach out to us if you find a discrepancy and need assistance. Okay. Now you'll notice in the image there, I did skip over 1.2. 1.2 is automatically calculated for you in OLDC as 10% of your total funding amount. So that gives you the 10% limit as to what can be carried over into 2021. line 1.3 is the only number that you have to report in this section, and that's the unobligated balance that you have for fiscal year 2020. Here you should report the total amount in funds that you didn't obligate based on your state or your government's definition of what constitutes an obligation. And once you've entered that amount and you go in OLDC to validate your form or to save it, it's going to automatically calculate the portion of that amount that can be carried over and the portion that would need to be returned, if any. And you'll see those in green on the slide. So those automatically get calculated for you. If you've reported any funds in this line, in line 1.3, then there are 2 notes fields that you're asked to complete. One notes field is to explain why those funds weren't obligated and why you may be carrying them over. And the second notes field is to explain how you plan to use those funds during the next fiscal year, 2021. Okay, now we're going to look at the new section of the form, Section 2, which is for reporting on the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. So Section 2 is focused on the LIHEAP CARES Act funds only. Once again, those are distinct from your regular LIHEAP funding awards. And this is just an important reminder that with the CARES Act funds, you have to obligate those CARES Act funds by the end of fiscal year 2021. Any share of the funds that you received during, any share of those funds you received, you could have used in fiscal year 2020, or you could have carried over for obligation in 2021. And so just as with your regular LIHEAP funds, for the CARES Act funds, you want to have fiscal procedures in place to track and distinguish those obligations so that they can be monitored and documented and reported. So the CARES Act section looks similar to Section 1, but has a little bit of difference in the lines that are included. The first line is going to be your CARES Act award amount. That's pre-populated for you in OLDC, and you should also compare that against your records to make sure that's what you expect it to be, and if you face any issues, to reach out to your liaison or reach out to us to help you work through them. The second line is your carryover amount. Here's where you'd report any funds that you didn't obligate and that by default are being carried over for obligation into fiscal year 2021. If you obligated all of your CARES Act funds during 2020, then you'd report $0 in this line. If you carried over all your funds to obligate them during 2021, then you'd put the same number that you have for line 2.1. Now, if you report any funds in this line, you should enter notes in the first notes field that's highlighted in purple to explain how you're planning to use those funds during 2021. There is a third line, line 2.3, that's the projected return of funds to HHS as of the end of fiscal year 2021. Grantees are expected to obligate all their CARES Act funds by the end of 2021, and this line is in this year's report and will be in next year's report to report any funds that you anticipate would not be obligated by the end of that period. If you do report any funds in this line, you should include detailed notes in the second notes field to explain why you anticipate you would not be able to obligate all of your CARES Act funds by the end of fiscal year 2021. Now I'm going to talk about the report versions using OLDC and some final reminders. So if you had a chance to look at the action transmittal and the instructions for the report that were issued by OCS, there are two distinct due dates. The first is that your preliminary report is due on October 30th, and the second is that your final report is due December 31st. The preliminary report is your initial report based on your current or recent estimates from your fiscal tracking system. Normally, the preliminary report is due in the end of August or the beginning of August during the same fiscal year. So you're projecting this year's preliminary report is due in October. So the fiscal year 2020 has already ended. So you should be able to use your current system information to be able to provide that preliminary report. The final report due at the end of December should be done at that time using your current information from your fiscal tracking system. And in upcoming months, you may receive updated fiscal information that would impact the unobligated balance and the carryover amounts that you report. That can be because of revised information you get from your partners or subgrantees. There could be changes that you make to funding due to funding reconciliations, or there could be refunds from vendors that would impact your unobligated balance amounts. So once again, your final report should use updated estimates from your fiscal tracking system. And you do have the option to submit revisions if there's a correction that's needed in the future. However, it's not expected that you'll continually update this report each and every time you have a new piece of information. It is expected that you'll submit this preliminary report and your final report using the information from your system you have at those times. So the Carryover Reallotment Report asks information that's also collected on other reports. You are asked to report information on the unobligated or carried over funds in your standard form 425, and for state grantees in your module 1 of your performance data form, which is your grantee survey. The information in those reports should be consistent. So if you later complete your fiscal year 2020 grantee survey, you want to make sure that for that report, you have the best estimate of your carried over funds at the time you complete that report. And you want to check it against this report and make sure they match. And if they don't, you would want to submit a revision to your carryover report with the correct amount so that there's consistency across those reports. To complete the report, you'll need to use the OLDC system. To submit a form, there's a 4-stage process. You need to enter the information and save it. Then you need to validate the form, and then you'll need to certify and submit it. And the user with the grant administrator role needs to perform the final functions to be able to submit your report. So some final reminders on the FY20 Carryover Reallotment Report. The report has gone from one section to 2 sections that you need to fill out for this year's report. Section 1 is regular LIHEAP funds. Section 2 is LIHEAP CARES Act funds. There are only $3 amounts that you need to enter. In Section 1, you need to enter the total amount in unobligated regular LIHEAP funds for fiscal year 2020. And in Section 2, you need to enter your unobligated CARES Act funds that are carried over to fiscal year 2021, and enter any anticipated CARES Act funds that wouldn't be obligated by the end of 2021. You should include detailed notes in those notes fields to explain any reporting and explain any issues with unobligated funds. And the preliminary report is due at the end of this week, and the final report is due at the end of December. Here are some resources for you related to this report. There's also a resource from the clearinghouse on the carryover limits and contact information for us. And now I'll open it up for questions to take any questions that have come in. Jorge, do we have any questions?
We have a number of questions, Dan, and I think we won't have time for all of them. So, I want to apologize if we don't get to your question, but we will follow up over email if we're not able to cover your question. So the first question that we have is, will the other reports be changed because of the CARES funds? What is the status of the other reports?
That's a great question. OCS is working to finalize and to release the action transmittals and due dates for the other FY20 reports. That would include the household report and the performance data form for state grantees. It is expected that there will be changes to the household report related to CARES Act and being able to report households assisted with CARES funds. For the performance data form for Module 1, that's the grantee survey. It's also anticipated you'll be asked to report information on the use of CARES Act funds. For the performance measures, Module 2, there are not anticipated to be any changes, so that report would stay the same as it was in the past. But you should be hearing from OCS shortly about those reports.
Thanks, Dan. I think we have time for one more question. This question is, can you please send out in writing or provide the transcript that states that it is not required to continually update the carryover report, that you want the initial and the final one?
Yeah, we can follow up with you, whoever asked the question, and we have guidance that has been issued related to what's required for this report, as well as what's described in the instructions. And we will be posting the webinar as well, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So if we weren't able to get to your question, we'll follow up over email.
Can you do the poll, Jorge? We have a poll. The reason we do these polls is because we want to make sure the training is useful and helpful for you, and so that we know how to improve them over time. So we do have a poll question for you that's anonymous and just helps us to understand. So the question is, how confident are you think you understand how to correctly complete the 2020 Carryover and Reallotment Report? I want to thank you all again for your time today and for sending in questions. We'll be following up on those, and if you face any challenges with your report, if you're seeing something that doesn't match, just reach out to us and to your liaison, and we'll work to provide you with assistance.
Dan, I actually got a comment that says, please share all questions and answers with all participants. Could people comment on the question box if this is something they would want to receive? Well, we're getting mixed responses on that. Okay, we will send anonymized responses to the questions to the people who asked for those. We got responses to our poll as well, so thank you for that. Here are the responses. Dan, is there anything you would like to add?
No, just thank you again. If you weren't able to get the slides and need them, reach out to us, and we'll be posting the webinar as well on the ACF YouTube channel likely within the next few days. So thank you all very much, and look forward to speaking with you soon.